Billionaire Ethan Carter's life shattered when his daughter, Olivia, was kidnapped without a trace. Years later, a mysterious doll in a withdrawn orphan's hands rekindles his hope and dread. As Ethan unravels a web of secrets, he discovers a shocking truth that will change everything he thought he knew. Ethan Carter stood at the window of his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath him like a vast, glittering sea. From up here, the world looked orderly, every building and street a testament to the empire he had built. But the view, once a source of pride, now felt meaningless, a hollow reminder of all he had achieved, and all he had lost. He turned away, the weight of memory pressing down on him. It had been 5 years since Olivia was taken. 5 years since his life had been shattered by a single, cruel act that no amount of wealth or influence could undo. Olivia had been his everything, the light in a world that often felt dark and cold. She was 7 years old, full of life and laughter, when she was kidnapped. Despite his relentless efforts, hiring the best investigators, offering rewards, even taking matters into his own hands, Olivia had vanished without a trace. The years that followed had been a blur of grief and fury. Ethan had thrown himself into his work, expanding his empire, making decisions with a ruthless efficiency that left his competitors scrambling. But no success, no amount of money, could fill the void Olivia's absence had left. He had become a man who had everything and nothing all at once. Today was his birthday, though it felt more like a cruel reminder than a day to celebrate. There was no one left to celebrate with. The usual stream of well-wishers, business partners, employees, distant acquaintances, had sent their obligatory messages, but they meant nothing to him. His once thriving social circle had withered over the years, and the only real connection he felt was to the memory of his daughter. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself restless, unable to shake the feeling that he needed to do something, anything, to break free from the suffocating grief that had become his constant companion. He thought about the many ways he could distract himself, but each idea felt more empty than the last. A party? He couldn't bear the thought of smiling through another event where everyone pretended everything was fine. A trip? The idea of being anywhere but here, surrounded by memories of Olivia, felt wrong. Then, an idea struck him, one that was so simple, he wondered why it hadn't come to him sooner. An orphanage. He had been a silent benefactor to several over the years, using his wealth to provide for children who had nothing. But he had never visited, never met the kids whose lives he was helping to improve. The thought of bringing some joy to those who needed it most suddenly felt like the only thing that made sense. He picked up the phone and made a call to his assistant, instructing her to arrange a visit to one of the orphanages he supported. It was a small, unassuming place on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the glitz and glamour of his usual surroundings. The director, Mrs. Thompson, was thrilled by the news of his visit, promising to have everything prepared for his arrival the next day. As he hung up the phone, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, something close to anticipation, tinged with the familiar ache of loss. He knew that nothing could ever bring Olivia back, but perhaps, in bringing a little happiness to other children, he could find some small measure of peace. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to make this day bearable. That night, as he prepared for bed, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He pulled open the drawer of his nightstand and took out a small, framed photograph of Olivia, her bright smile frozen in time. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had lost. Tomorrow, he would go to the orphanage, and he would try to make a difference, however small. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was taking a step forward, instead of being dragged back into the past. The orphanage was a humble building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustle of the city Ethan Carter knew so well. As his car pulled up to the front gate, the low murmur of children's laughter reached his ears, a sound that, for a moment, soothed the tension he hadn't realized he was holding. The director, Mrs. Thompson, greeted him with the same warm smile she had offered over the phone, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she extended a hand. "Mr. Carter, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "The children have been looking forward to this all week." Ethan shook her hand, his mind already drifting toward the task ahead. He had come here with a simple goal: to bring some joy to these children, to give them a day that stood out from the routine of their lives. He'd made sure his assistant had arranged for the best: piles of gifts, toys that would light up the eyes of any child, and enough treats to fill the orphanage's small cafeteria. As he walked through the front doors, the sound of excitement grew louder. The children were gathered in the main hall, their faces alight with curiosity and anticipation. Ethan's entrance caused a brief hush, followed by a wave of eager chatter as they spotted the brightly wrapped packages being carried in by his team. He offered them a smile, one that felt almost foreign on his face. It had been a long time since he'd been in the presence of so much unguarded joy. As the gifts were handed out, Ethan moved among the children, asking their names, listening as they talked excitedly about the toys they were receiving. There were remote control cars, dolls, art supplies, and books, each carefully chosen to bring happiness to these kids, if only for a while. But as he moved through the crowd, something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. A little girl sat alone near the back of the room, a stark contrast to the others who were eagerly tearing into their gifts. She was small, with dark hair that hung in soft waves around her face. Her expression was distant, her gaze fixed on a spot somewhere far beyond the walls of the orphanage. In her arms, she held a doll, clutching it tightly as if it were a lifeline. The doll was old, its fabric worn and its colors faded, but there was something about it that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. He couldn't place it at first, but the familiarity of it gnawed at him, pulling him closer. Ethan found himself moving toward her, compelled by a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something he didn't want to name. As he approached, he noticed how detached she seemed, her small fingers gripping the doll with a quiet intensity. She didn't look up as he knelt down beside her, didn't react to the bustle and noise of the room around her. "Hi," Ethan said gently, trying to keep his voice soft so as not to startle her. "What's your name?" The girl looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his with a hesitation that made Ethan's heart ache. "Emily," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan nodded, glancing down at the doll in her arms. The closer he looked, the more certain he became that he knew this doll, knew it in a way that was impossible, yet undeniable. He felt a cold shiver run through him as recognition dawned. It wasn't just any doll. It was the exact replica of a custom-made toy he had given Olivia for her 5th birthday. The doll had been a one-of-a-kind creation, made by a master toymaker in Europe. Ethan had spent months arranging for it, making sure every detail was perfect, from the doll's deep blue eyes to the intricately embroidered dress. There had been no other like it, no other that could match the love and care that had gone into its making. And yet, here it was, cradled in the arms of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the doll, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be? It wasn't possible. Olivia's doll had disappeared the day she was taken. He had searched for it, just as he had searched for her, but it had been lost along with everything else that mattered. "Emily," he began, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm, "where did you get this doll?" The girl's grip on the doll tightened, her eyes darting away, as if she was suddenly aware of the significance of the question. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Ethan feared she might retreat further into her shell. But then, finally, she spoke. "She's mine," Emily whispered, her words barely audible. "I've always had her." Ethan felt a rush of emotions, a torrent of hope, fear, and confusion all at once. This couldn't be a coincidence. The doll was too unique, too specific to be anything but what he thought it was. But if this was Olivia's doll, if it had somehow found its way here, what did that mean? His mind raced with questions, none of which he had answers to. Was there a connection between this girl and his daughter? Or was it a cruel twist of fate, a painful reminder of all he had lost? He wanted to ask more, to press for details, but he held back, sensing that any more questions might push Emily away. Instead, he simply nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "That's a very special doll," he said softly. "You're lucky to have her." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed far too deep for someone so young. She didn't respond, just held the doll closer, as if it were the only thing in the world that made her feel safe. Ethan stayed there for a moment longer, watching her, before finally standing up. His mind was in turmoil, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief and desperate hope. He had come here today to bring a little happiness to these children, but instead, he had found something that threatened to pull him back into the darkness he had tried so hard to escape. As he moved away, back toward the center of the room where the other children were still playing, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Emily and that doll from his mind. The questions burned in his chest, demanding answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of children playing with their new toys, their laughter ringing out in bursts of pure, unfiltered joy. But for Ethan Carter, the world had narrowed to a single point, the small figure of Emily sitting alone in the corner, clutching that hauntingly familiar doll. He had moved away from her, trying to rejoin the flow of the day, but his thoughts kept dragging him back. Every logical explanation unraveled the longer he thought about it. This doll, so unique, so intricately tied to the daughter he had lost, shouldn't be here. It couldn't be here. And yet, it was. Ethan felt his breath quicken as he turned back toward Emily. He was a man who had faced down ruthless competitors, negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but the thought of approaching this fragile, withdrawn girl made his hands tremble. His footsteps were slow, measured, as if the wrong move might shatter whatever fragile connection existed between him, this child, and the echoes of his past. As he neared her, Ethan saw that Emily had withdrawn even further into herself, her small frame almost curling around the doll as if to protect it from the world. She seemed so alone, so detached from the lively chaos around her. It was as if she existed in a bubble that no one else could penetrate. No one but him, perhaps. "Emily," he said softly, crouching down beside her once more. He kept his voice low, gentle, not wanting to startle her. "Can we talk about your doll?" Emily's grip tightened on the doll, her eyes flicking up to meet his for the briefest of moments before dropping again. That single glance was enough to send a jolt through Ethan. There was something there, something beyond the sadness. A flicker of recognition, of understanding that ran deeper than a child's usual wariness. "It's okay," Ethan continued, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. I've seen this doll before. A long time ago. It was very special to someone I care about. Can you tell me where you got it?" Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Ethan feared she wouldn't answer at all. He tried to stay calm, but his pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the noise of the other children. He had to know. He had to. "Did someone give it to you?" he pressed, though his voice was still soft, still careful. "Did you find it somewhere?" Emily shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the worn fabric of the doll's dress as if she were trying to find the right words. Ethan waited, his heart in his throat, every second that passed only deepening the gnawing sense of urgency. But when Emily finally spoke, it was a single word, so quiet that Ethan almost missed it. No. The word hung in the air, and with it, a terrible realization began to settle in Ethan's mind. Emily wasn't just unwilling to talk, she couldn't. Whatever connection she had to this doll, whatever it meant to her, it was locked away, out of his reach. He felt a wave of hopelessness crash over him, a darkness that he had fought so hard to keep at bay since Olivia's disappearance. The idea that this tiny girl might hold the key to everything he had lost, and yet be completely unable to unlock it, was almost too much to bear. But then he noticed something, a subtle shift in Emily's expression, a tiny crease in her brow as if she was trying to remember, trying to piece together fragments of something just out of reach. Her eyes flicked up to his again, and this time, they held his gaze. There was something there, something that made Ethan's chest tighten with a strange mix of hope and fear. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but before he could speak, the pressure that had been building inside him suddenly broke free. A scream, raw, guttural, and full of years of pent-up agony, tore from his throat, filling the room with a sound so primal, so filled with grief and horror, that it silenced every other noise around him. The room went deathly still. The children, the staff, even Emily, everyone froze, their eyes wide with shock. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, as if time itself had been suspended by the force of Ethan's outburst. His own ears rang with the sound, a sound that felt as though it had come from somewhere deep within him, a place he had long tried to bury. Ethan's hands flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with disbelief at what he had just done. He hadn't screamed since the day Olivia had been taken, the day the police had told him they had no leads, no clues, nothing. The day he had realized that his daughter was truly gone. That scream had been his last act of defiance against a world that had taken everything from him, and now it had returned, unbidden and unstoppable. The orphanage staff rushed toward him, their faces filled with concern and confusion. Mrs. Thompson was the first to reach him, her hand on his arm, her voice low and soothing as she tried to bring him back from the edge. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "are you all right? What happened?" Ethan couldn't answer. His eyes were locked on Emily, who sat motionless, her doll still clutched tightly in her arms. But her gaze had changed. The flicker of recognition had grown, deepened, until it was a flame that burned with something almost like understanding. But whether it was the understanding of a lost child or the awakening of a buried memory, Ethan couldn't tell. All he knew was that this girl, this doll, and this moment had shattered something inside him that he hadn't even realized was still breakable. I'm sorry," he managed to choke out, his voice raw and broken. He didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? How could he tell them that a single doll had just ripped open wounds he had spent years trying to heal? Mrs. Thompson squeezed his arm gently, guiding him away from the children who were still staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. "It's all right, Mr. Carter. Maybe we should step outside for a moment." Ethan nodded numbly, allowing her to lead him out of the room. But as he glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes met Emily's once more. The recognition in her eyes was still there, stronger than before, and it left him with a question that he couldn't shake. Who was this girl, really? And what did she know? As the door closed behind him, the question burned in his mind, refusing to let go. Ethan stood just outside the playroom, his heart still pounding in his chest. The muffled sound of the children's laughter had resumed behind the door, but it felt distant, like something happening in another world. Mrs. Thompson hovered nearby, her concern palpable as she tried to piece together what had just happened. "Mr. Carter," she began gently, her voice full of care, "are you sure you're all right? I've never seen someone react like that before." Ethan could barely register her words, his mind swirling with thoughts that refused to settle. How could he explain to her, or to himself, the sheer terror that had gripped him when he saw that doll? It wasn't just an object, it was a ghost from his past, a piece of his shattered life that had somehow resurfaced in the most improbable way. I'm fine, he lied, running a shaky hand through his hair. But the words felt hollow, even to his own ears. He knew he wasn't fine. He was teetering on the edge of something he couldn't fully comprehend, and it terrified him. Mrs. Thompson gave him a sympathetic look, her eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. "Would you like to sit down for a moment? We could go to my office, have some tea." "No," Ethan cut her off, more sharply than he intended. He took a breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I need to speak to Emily. I need to know where she got that doll." The director hesitated, clearly uncertain about the wisdom of pushing Emily any further. "Mr. Carter, I understand that you're upset, but Emily, she's a very quiet child. She doesn't open up easily, and I don't want to overwhelm her." Ethan shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. "I'm not trying to overwhelm her," he insisted, though he could feel the desperation in his voice. "I just need to know. That doll, it's not just any doll. It belonged to my daughter." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise, her hand coming to rest on her chest as she took in his words. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "It's okay," Ethan interrupted, though nothing about this situation felt okay. "But I have to find out where she got it. Please, just let me talk to her again. I'll be careful. I promise." The director seemed to weigh his plea, her gaze flicking back toward the playroom where Emily still sat, isolated from the other children. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "All right," she agreed, her voice soft. "But let me be there with you. Emily trusts me, and I think she'll feel safer that way." Ethan nodded, relief mingling with the anxiety that continued to gnaw at him. He followed Mrs. Thompson back into the room, his eyes immediately finding Emily. She was still sitting where he had left her, the doll held close, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. Mrs. Thompson approached her first, kneeling down beside her with a reassuring smile. "Emily, sweetheart, Mr. Carter would like to talk to you again. Is that okay?" Emily looked up at her, then at Ethan. Her eyes were wide, filled with that same sad wisdom he had seen before. She didn't say anything, but after a moment, she nodded slightly, a small gesture that felt like a fragile thread of connection. Ethan knelt down too, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the right approach. He didn't want to scare her away, but the urgency of his need to know was almost overwhelming. "Emily," he began softly, trying to keep his voice steady, "I know this might be hard to talk about, but I need you to help me understand. That doll, it's very special to me. It looks just like a doll I gave to someone I love very much. Can you tell me where you got it?" Emily's gaze dropped to the doll, her small fingers stroking its worn fabric. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Ethan feared she might shut down completely. But then, she whispered something so softly that he had to lean closer to hear. "I don't remember," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan's heart sank, frustration and helplessness twisting inside him. "You don't remember?" he echoed, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. "Not at all? Did someone give it to you? Did you find it somewhere?" Emily shook her head, her grip on the doll tightening. "I've always had her," she repeated, the same words she had said before. There was a finality in her tone that made Ethan feel like he was hitting a wall, a barrier he couldn't break through. Desperation clawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep pushing without scaring her away. "Are you sure, Emily? There must be something someone who gave it to you, or where you might have found it. But Emily just shook her head again, more firmly this time, and Ethan could see the tension building in her small frame. She was closing herself off, retreating into that quiet place where he couldn't reach her. Mrs. Thompson, sensing the shift, placed a gentle hand on Ethan's arm. "I think that's enough for now, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "We don't want to upset her." Ethan knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. He had come here looking for answers, and now it felt like they were slipping further away with every passing moment. He looked at Emily one last time, trying to find some sign, some glimmer of the truth in her eyes, but all he saw was the same sad, guarded expression. Slowly, he stood up, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He felt the weight of Mrs. Thompson's gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet it. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the front door of the orphanage, Ethan paused, his hand on the doorknob. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every word Emily had said, or hadn't said. The doll, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the way she had clung to that toy as if it were the only thing that mattered. It all added up to something, but what? He didn't know. Not yet. But he was determined to find out. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. The world outside the orphanage seemed almost surreal, too bright, too loud after the intensity of the last hour. But as he walked toward his car, the determination in his chest hardened into resolve. The drive back to the city was a blur. Ethan's thoughts churned like a storm, pulling him into memories he had fought to bury. By the time he reached his penthouse, he felt like a man on the brink of a revelation he wasn't sure he wanted to face. But there was no turning back now. The doll, Emily, the look in her eyes, it all pointed to something he had missed, something buried in the past that was clawing its way to the surface. Once inside, Ethan wasted no time. He headed straight to his study, a room that had become more of a museum to his former life than a place of work. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but it was the large wooden desk in the center that drew him in. There, hidden in a locked drawer, were the files, every scrap of information he had collected over the years about Olivia's disappearance. He had combed through them countless times, each time hoping for a clue he might have overlooked. But today, the search felt different, charged with a new urgency. Ethan unlocked the drawer and pulled out the thick folder. The weight of it in his hands was both comforting and suffocating. He opened it, spreading the contents across the desk, police reports, witness statements, photographs, and his own notes scrawled in the margins of every page. The investigation had been exhaustive. He had spared no expense, hiring private investigators, offering rewards, even conducting his own inquiries when the authorities hit dead ends. But Olivia's disappearance had remained an enigma, a black hole that had swallowed up his life. Until now, he had resigned himself to the possibility that he might never know the truth. But the encounter with Emily had changed everything. He started with the police reports, the official narrative he had memorized long ago. Olivia had been taken from their home while he was out of town on business. The nanny had been the only one there, and she had been knocked unconscious, leaving her with no memory of the intruder. There were no fingerprints, no traces of DNA, nothing but the open door of Olivia's bedroom and the emptiness that followed. Next were the witness statements. A neighbor had reported seeing a dark van parked near the house around the time of the kidnapping, but the description was vague, and the vehicle had never been found. Another neighbor had mentioned a stranger in the area a few days earlier, but that lead had also gone cold. It was as if Olivia had simply vanished into thin air. Ethan's eyes moved over the pages, his mind replaying every detail, every dead end. But then, something caught his attention, a note he had made during one of his late-night sessions, scrawled in the margin of a witness statement. It was a name, Anthony Sloan. Sloan had been one of the private investigators Ethan had hired in the early days of the search. He was a former detective, known for his dogged determination and unconventional methods. Sloan had been the only one who hadn't given up, even when the trail went cold. But his methods had been too aggressive, too reckless, and Ethan had eventually cut ties with him. The last he'd heard, Sloan had left town, disillusioned and bitter. But what if Sloan had found something? What if Ethan had dismissed him too soon? Ethan grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Sam Calloway, an old friend who still worked in the city's police department. Calloway had been his go-to for inside information during the investigation, always willing to bend the rules a little in the name of justice. "Ethan," Calloway answered after a few rings, his voice gruff but familiar. "Been a while." "I need a favor, Sam," Ethan said, skipping the pleasantries. "I need to find someone, Anthony Sloan. He was a PI I hired years ago. I need to know where he is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sloan, huh? That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Last I knew, he was off the grid, but I can ask around." "Please do," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's important." "Give me a few hours," Calloway replied. "I'll see what I can dig up." Ethan hung up and returned to the files, but his mind kept drifting back to Sloan. What had the man been chasing? And why hadn't Ethan followed up on it? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something crucial, something that could have changed everything. Hours passed, the city darkening outside the windows as the weight of the past pressed down on him. Then, finally, his phone buzzed with a message from Calloway. "Got a lead on Sloan. He's living out in the woods, upstate. Address attached. Be careful, Ethan. Sloan's not the man he used to be, ***. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and headed out, the address burned into his mind. The drive was long, taking him out of the city and into the dense, shadowy woods that seemed to swallow the road. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fully fallen, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. The cabin was small, a modest structure hidden among the trees. A single light flickered in the window, the only sign of life. Ethan parked his car and approached cautiously, his nerves on edge. He didn't know what he expected to find, but the sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a man who was barely recognizable from the photos Ethan had in his files. Anthony Sloan had aged, his face lined and weary, his eyes dull with a weariness that spoke of years of disappointment. But there was still a sharpness there, a glint of the man who had once been relentless in his pursuit of the truth. "Ethan Carter," Sloan said, his voice rough from disuse. "Didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to be here," Ethan admitted. "But I need your help, Sloan. I need to know what you found out about my daughter." Sloan's gaze flicked over him, assessing, weighing. Then he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said. "There's something you need to see." Inside, the cabin was cluttered with papers, photographs, and notes, a disorganized maze of information that seemed to spill from every surface. Sloan led Ethan to a small table where a series of photographs were laid out, some old, some more recent. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the images. Sloan tapped one of the photos, his finger trembling slightly. "This is what I was working on when you pulled the plug," he said. I was following a lead, something that didn't sit right with me about the kidnapping. I think someone close to you knew more than they were letting on. And I think Olivia's kidnapping wasn't what it seemed. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the photograph. It was of Olivia, but not as he remembered her. She looked older, her eyes wary, her expression guarded. And she was with someone, a woman Ethan didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar in a way he couldn't place. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice tight with fear and anger. "Who is that woman?" Sloane sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's the hidden truth, Carter. That woman, she's the key to everything. And if I'm right, she's been hiding something from you all along." Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about his daughter's disappearance, about the life they had lived, was unraveling before his eyes. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by the revelations from Anthony Sloane's cabin as he drove back to the city. The woman in the photograph, the possibility that Olivia's kidnapping wasn't what it seemed, everything was tangled in his mind, forming a knot that refused to loosen. The only thread that seemed to connect it all was Emily, the little girl with the doll. And now, more than ever, Ethan knew he had to get closer to her, to understand what she knew, or what she might have been told. 2 days later, Ethan found himself standing outside the orphanage once more. This time, his approach was different. He wasn't just a benefactor visiting out of duty, he was a man on a mission, driven by the need for answers that only Emily could provide. But he also knew he couldn't rush her. Whatever trust he hoped to build would have to be earned slowly, carefully. Mrs. Thompson greeted him with the same warmth as before, though he could see the curiosity in her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said, ushering him inside, "it's wonderful to see you again. The children were thrilled by your last visit." Ethan nodded, trying to focus. "I'm glad. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to offer more support to the orphanage. Whatever you need, repairs, new equipment, staff, I'll cover it." The director's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by the sudden offer. "That's incredibly generous of you, Mr. Carter. We could certainly use the help. But I have to ask. Is this about Emily?" Ethan didn't flinch. "In part, yes. I want to help, but I also want to spend more time with her. There's something about her that I can't ignore. I think she might know something important." Mrs. Thompson studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "Emily is a special child. She's been through a lot, though she rarely talks about it. If you can reach her, Mr. Carter, it might be good for both of you." With that, Mrs. Thompson led him back to the playroom. The children were scattered across the room, playing with the toys Ethan had brought during his last visit. But his eyes were drawn immediately to Emily, who sat in the same corner as before, the doll cradled in her arms. "Emily," Mrs. Thompson called softly, approaching the little girl with Ethan by her side. "Mr. Carter is back. He'd like to talk to you again, if that's okay." Emily looked up, her dark eyes flicking between Mrs. Thompson and Ethan. There was a flicker of recognition, a brief flash of something in her gaze that told him she remembered their last conversation. But her expression remained guarded, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust him. Ethan knelt down beside her, keeping his distance so she wouldn't feel crowded. "Hi, Emily," he said gently. "I brought some more things for the orphanage. Do you like to draw? I brought some new coloring books and crayons." Emily glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Emily reached out, taking the pack of crayons Ethan offered. She didn't smile, but she didn't pull away either, a small victory in Ethan's mind. Over the next few days, Ethan made a habit of visiting the orphanage, each time bringing something new. Sometimes it was art supplies, other times books or puzzles. He would sit with Emily, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking softly about the pictures she colored or the stories in the books he read to her. He never pressed her about the doll again, sensing that she needed to trust him before she would open up. It was on the fifth visit that something changed. Ethan had brought a book of fairy tales, the kind Olivia had loved as a child. As he read, Emily leaned in closer, her small body relaxing against his side. It was the first time she had shown any physical closeness, and Ethan felt a surge of hope. When the story ended, Emily didn't move away. Instead, she looked up at him, her expression pensive. "The doll," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, Emily? What about the doll?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the book in her lap. "A lady gave it to me," she whispered, almost as if she was afraid of being overheard. "She was nice. She said I should keep it safe." Ethan's pulse quickened. "A lady? Can you tell me more about her? What did she look like?" Emily frowned, her small brow furrowing as she tried to recall. "She had brown hair," she said slowly. "And she smelled like flowers. She was always smiling, but her eyes were sad." Ethan's mind raced, trying to fit the description to the woman in the photograph Sloane had shown him. Could it be the same person? Was this woman somehow connected to Olivia's disappearance? "Do you remember where you were when you got the doll?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice calm, though inside he was anything but. "Were you here at the orphanage?" Emily shook her head, her eyes distant as if she was trying to reach back into a memory she had long buried. "No, it was before. Before I came here. I was at a house, but I don't remember where. The lady would visit me sometimes. She said the doll would protect me." Ethan's breath caught. Protect her from what? The more Emily spoke, the more questions arose, each one more troubling than the last. The fragmented details painted a picture that was still out of focus, but the edges were beginning to take shape. "Did the lady ever tell you her name?" he asked carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her. Emily shook her head again. "No. She just called me sweetheart." The word sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was such a simple, endearing term, yet coming from a stranger, it felt almost sinister. Who was this woman, and why had she given Emily that doll? The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together yet, not in any way that made sense. Mrs. Thompson had been watching from a distance, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. When Emily seemed to retreat back into herself, she stepped in gently, placing a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "You've done very well, Emily," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "Why don't you go and color for a bit? Mr. Carter and I need to talk." Emily nodded, slipping away to a table where some other children were drawing. Ethan watched her go, his mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. "That's the most she's said in a long time," Mrs. Thompson remarked, her tone quiet but hopeful. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Ethan nodded, though his heart was heavy. "But it's not enough," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I need to know more." "She's opened a door, Mr. Carter," Mrs. Thompson said kindly. "It's going to take time, but I believe she'll tell you more when she's ready." Ethan wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure how much time he had. Every word Emily spoke had only deepened the mystery, revealing a web of secrets that seemed to connect back to Olivia. But the connections were tenuous, elusive. Ethan sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp. Before him lay a map of the city, marked with various locations and notes, alongside the fragmented clues Emily had given him. The woman with sad eyes and a floral scent, the doll as a protector, pieces of a puzzle that had haunted him for too long. But now, for the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. He knew he had to find this woman, whoever she was. And with the resources at his disposal, he was determined to uncover her identity. The next morning, he set his plan into motion. He reached out to an old contact, Marcus Landry, a retired detective with a reputation for digging up what others couldn't. Ethan knew that if anyone could trace the faint leads Emily had given him, it was Marcus. Within hours, Marcus had set up a small team to scour the city for any information on a woman matching Emily's description. Ethan spared no expense, pouring money into surveillance, private databases, and old-school legwork. Every woman who had ever worked at or near the orphanage, every house that had once taken in a foster child, was scrutinized. Days turned into a week, and then, finally, a breakthrough. Marcus called Ethan late one evening, his voice tense with the gravity of what he had discovered. "Ethan," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for small talk. "We found her. The woman who gave Emily the doll." Ethan's heart raced. "Who is she?" There was a pause on the other end, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was heavy with something that felt like regret. "Ethan, it's someone you know. Someone close." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His mind scrambled to process the implications, to prepare for what Marcus was about to say. "Who?" Ethan demanded, his voice tight. "Catherine Shaw." Ethan's world tilted. Catherine Shaw. The name reverberated through him like a bell. She had been Olivia's godmother, his late wife's best friend, someone who had been there from the beginning, at his wedding, at Olivia's birth, and, tragically, at her funeral. Catherine was practically family, someone he had trusted implicitly, even after Olivia's disappearance. She had been one of the few who had stayed close, offering comfort, a shoulder to lean on when everything else in his life had fallen apart. Ethan struggled to understand, to reconcile the woman he knew with the stranger she must have been. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no mistake," Marcus confirmed, his voice steady. "We tracked down several sources. She was seen with a little girl matching Emily's description around the time Emily would have received the doll. She also fits Emily's description of the woman: brown hair, a floral scent. She was hiding in plain sight, Ethan." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. How could he have missed this? How could he have been so blind? His mind raced through memories of Catherine, how she had always seemed just a little too concerned, a little too invested in Olivia's life. But he had chalked it up to her being a protective godmother, someone who loved Olivia almost as much as he did. "I need to see her," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I need to hear it from her." "Be careful, Ethan," Marcus warned. "She's not who you thought she was." Ethan didn't need the warning. He could feel the truth seeping into his bones, a cold, hard reality that was quickly replacing the disbelief. But he needed answers, and he would get them, no matter what it took. That night, Ethan drove to Catherine's home, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, but also a desperate need to understand. The drive felt surreal, as if he were watching himself from a distance, moving through a nightmare that had become all too real. When he arrived, Catherine greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile, but Ethan could barely return it. As they stepped inside, he wasted no time, turning to face her in the dimly lit foyer. "Catherine," he began, his voice steady but cold, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She blinked, taken aback by his tone. Of course, Ethan. What is it? Emily, he said, watching her closely for any sign of recognition. You gave her that doll, didn't you? The change in Catherine was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes widened slightly, her breath hitching almost imperceptibly. For a moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, Ethan knew. He knew everything. Yes, she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I gave her the doll. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Why, Catherine? Why would you do that? What aren't you telling me? Catherine's composure cracked, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ethan saw real fear in her eyes. I did it to protect her, Ethan. To protect Olivia. The air seemed to leave the room, leaving Ethan in a vacuum of disbelief. Olivia? What are you talking about? Olivia's gone. She's been gone for years. No, Ethan, Catherine said, shaking her head as tears welled up in her eyes. She's not gone. She's alive. I kept her safe all these years, away from the people who wanted to hurt her. I had no choice. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, his mind struggling to grasp what Catherine was saying. You took her? You let me believe she was gone? Catherine's tears fell freely now, her voice breaking. I had to. There were things you didn't know, people who would have hurt her if they knew she was still alive. I couldn't tell you, Ethan. I couldn't risk it. I did what I had to do to keep her safe. Ethan's vision blurred with a mix of rage and sorrow. All this time, he choked out, all this time, you let me suffer, let me grieve. How could you do that to me? To her? I thought I was doing the right thing, Catherine sobbed. I never meant to hurt you, Ethan. But there was no other way. I gave Emily the doll to lead you to her when it was finally safe. I didn't want you to lose her forever. The room spun around Ethan as he tried to process the weight of Catherine's words. Olivia was alive. The daughter he had mourned, the life he had tried to rebuild without her, everything had been built on a lie. And yet, the truth was even more complicated than the lie. Olivia was out there, somewhere, and Catherine held the key to finding her. Where is she? Ethan demanded, his voice a raw mix of hope and fury. Where's Olivia? Catherine looked at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'll take you to her, she whispered. But you have to promise me, Ethan, you have to promise that you'll keep her safe. Ethan didn't hesitate. Take me to her. No. As they drove through the night, the weight of everything that had happened settled on Ethan like a suffocating blanket. The truth had shattered the world he thought he knew, but as they neared their destination, one thing became clear: he was finally on the path to finding Olivia. When they arrived at the small, secluded house where Olivia had been hidden away, Ethan's heart pounded with a mix of dread and anticipation. The door creaked open, and there she was, a young woman now, with the same blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for years. Dad? Olivia's voice trembled as she stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. Ethan's world tilted as he took in the sight of his daughter, alive and real, in front of him. He moved toward her, his own tears blurring his vision, and pulled her into his arms, feeling her warmth, her heartbeat. As father and daughter held each other in the darkness, Ethan knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that might never fully resolve the pain of the past, but would be written together, day by day.